200 years ago, warriors from Grand River were amassing in this area right at this date. The Americans were lining up on the other side across the river, and there were thousands of them. And there were only about 150 warriors. There were probably a few from Mississauga and a few Anishinaabe warriors gathered together, and they faced quite a question. What are a handful of warriors going to do against thousands of well-armed, well-trained Americans? There were some British troops here and some militia. Well, our people have always been kind of pragmatic. Half the warriors said, we don't stand a chance in heck to win this battle. I think we better go home and pick corn. So they left. And it left about 80 people, 80 warriors. And when the cannon started firing on October 13th, I don't think any of us can imagine the thunder that was created here down because of the gorge. It shook the ground. The smoke from the guns just made it seem like you were entering into the gates of the underworld. And as we know, General Brock, Major General Brock, was actually killed as he was trying to retake the escarpment from the Americans who had captured the high ground. And then his second in command, trying to rally everybody. Come on, let's go up there. And he got shot. John Norton and John Brant were two of the primary leaders of the war captains of this small group of warriors. And they decided to skirt around and try to sneak up on this American force. When they reached the base of the escarpment, they could hear the guns going off, they could see people, see all of the American uniforms there. And John Norton had to turn to his men and he says, well, this is what we came here for. Your ancestors never shied away from a fight, and now it's our turn. So let's go where we came here, and they headed up the hill. Much to everybody's amazement, especially the Americans, who felt it was going to be a cakewalk across Canada. And the numbers showed it was likely to be. But that small handful of warriors, 80 of them, were able to hold back several thousand Americans long enough for the British to send reinforcements and other native warriors to show up. So I've often wondered, what did it take? John Norton, John Brant, and those men, the courage to do that, the skill, they knew the landscape, they knew how to use their weapons really well, and they also knew that if they didn't fight, their nations might not survive. They didn't fight necessarily in defense of Canada, even they fought certainly as allies to the Crown, but the reason why they fought so hard is to defend this land right here where the bones of our ancestors are buried. This is a very powerful place. Now, we believe downriver at Niagara Falls, that's where the thunder beings live, the ones who create thunder and lightning. There's a little cave across the river. They call it Devil's Hole, but that's only because when the non-natives showed up, they saw some people dancing there that looked like devils. Well, you know that story, right? The Red Devils. And, but it's also a very historic ground because this is the passageway through which colonization took place. If it wasn't for this corridor here and the assistance of our native people getting across this treacherous river, who knows what would have happened in North America. I'm a Tuscarora. We follow our mother's side of the family. My dad was a Mohawk from Grand River. My mother's a Tuscarora from across the river. My father's relatives fought against my mother's relatives during the War of 1812. They fought against each other during the American Revolutionary War. Fortunately for me, they kissed and made up in the 50s and they made a bunch of kids. But there was a difference. I always tell people I grew up in a bicultural home. My Tuscarora mother is very different than my Mohawk father. My Mohawk father from Canada is very different than my Tuscarora mother from New York. They have different, even though we're one people, different experiences. So one thing we learned about the War of 1812 is that there are many different histories. There's not one single history, many different views of that history, and our people were so divided. I had Tuscarora relatives at Grand River when the war broke out, and they didn't want to go over there and fight their relatives. So Red Jacket, you heard of Red Jacket before, legendary Seneca leader, he comes from Buffalo, sends message over here and asks his relatives at Grand River, how about this? Let's not fight in this war. Because you know what? The British didn't keep their word after the American Revolutionary War. The Americans are going to win anyway, so how about if we just sit back, let them duke it out? And for one shining moment, he thought he had everybody agreeing for us to remain neutral. But John Norton, who was half Scottish and half Cherokee, had the power. If he were to walk in this room and start talking, we'd all want to follow him out the door, kind of like Mr. Martin. He has the ability to speak well, to lead well, and bring people up off of their seat into action. So John Norton convinced the warriors, I don't know what those old peace chiefs are thinking about. I don't care what your clan mothers are saying. I don't care what your relatives across the river are saying. But we have a duty to defend the crown. That duty is codified in this belt here. Now, this is a replica of a wampum belt. It's called the Friendship Belt. It represents the covenant chain. Imagine this at the time. This is the king of England. This is one of our leaders here. They hold the chain. The chain goes all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And then whenever the king wanted our attention, he'd shake that chain, reverberate all the way across the ocean. And our leaders would say, okay, now what does he want? Because he kept shaking that chain all the time, you know. And usually when he shook the chain, he wanted one of two things: a little more land or a lot more warriors. Defend us interests. So we fought since 1677. That's when this first agreement was made. Think about that. Older than the United States, older than Canada, we have this treaty relationship with Great Britain. But the chain is a two-way thing. So I'm sure you heard about what happened in Caledonia. We were shaking the chain. In Brantford, we were shaking the chain. Across the Haldeman Track, shaking the chain. When Samsung showed up, we're shaking the chain. So at any rate, this, we keep getting a busy signal from this end. I don't know how that works. Have to improve our cell phone technology. To make it worse, our relatives over in New York had a covenant chain with the United States. Could you give me a hand with this here? And like all things American, the bigger, the better. They made the world's biggest covenant chain. George Washington commissioned this in 1790. We can see George Washington and our leaders holding the covenant chain in the Longhouse, and the 13 figures represent the original 13 states, the new states. He made a covenant to protect our land, the Haudenosaunee land. So as you can imagine, if we were all living back then, we could see the war clouds forming on the horizon, and we're saying, okay, who are we going to go with? Half of us feel, well, we have this very ancient covenant chain with the crown. We have to defend their interests. The others saying, yes, but we also have this new relationship with the new states that beat the crown. So maybe we should go along with them. But fate was decided here at that moment at Queenston Heights, and like I said, Norton and his small band of warriors were able to work quite effectively that day. And that great victory that was enjoyed helped to swing the tide, and more of our warriors decided maybe the British have a chance. But one thing for sure, the British had no chance without us. Brock understood that, and the military understood that. But what I wanted to explore today was, what were the vision of our people back in 1812? What is it that they imagined we would be living today? I don't know if this is what they had in mind, but let's see. In the 19th century, it was a very different vision that our people had to overcome. And I love to hate this phrase. Which is better, to brutalize or pauperize, to destroy the native people, or to humanize, civilize, and Christianize? This became the anthem of the native reformers in the 19th century, the people who actually started many of the schools. But I think I'd like you to kind of remember that phrase as you go back and do your work and try to think of what this represents. Because unfortunately, in the 19th century, a lot of our people did become very poor. They suffered through a brutal time. But the alternative, to humanize, to civilize, to Christianize, as if, first of all, we weren't human, and that we weren't civilized, and that we could only be saved through Christianity, is part of the root of our educational problem. So maybe we need to answer or ask a different question. Now, I've been a Native educator for 42 years, and I don't know what works, but I know what doesn't work. So we've been trying to fit this circular culture in a square classroom, and it just doesn't work. I mean, we have a round dance, they have a square dance. What more do we need to know? That it's just two different things. So instead, maybe we should, instead of trying to carve away on our kids to make them fit into this square box, we should ask ourselves this question. What do they need? What do our children need to be fulfilled as active citizens of their native nations. That's what Brant and even Norton and Tecumseh and all of those guys who fought back then, that's what they imagined, that the nations would survive and that the young people would be the people to make the nation thrive. This is the earliest known picture of me. And you can see I was very confused about my cultural identity. The only heroes I had were the guys on TV, the cowboys. They always beat the Indians, so I wanted to be a cowboy. And so I shot my brother in the back just to watch him die. But my parents became concerned, maybe this isn't such a good thing. My dad was an iron worker in Buffalo, and they decided to leave the city and take us out into the country to try to reconnect to some things. But even my parents didn't understand what it meant to really be indigenous or native. In 1811, 1812, this fellow, they called him Open Door. He was Tecumseh's brother. He had a great vision. And what he said, if you want to save yourselves, you have to have a personal revolution in your way of life. And boy, isn't that still true today? If we want our kids to be strong and to be the kind of people that are going to lead our nations to the future, we have to show them in our conduct, in our thinking, that it's possible to do that. We can't tell our kids to do things that we don't manifest in our own lives. So teachers, administrators, chiefs, everybody has to create this revolution inside of ourselves to get rid of all of the baggage that's holding us up and to find that original fire, that thing that made our ancestors thrive, get back to that. His brother Tecumseh then talked a lot about creating this united sovereign territory, and he wanted to oust all of the people and all of the habits that undermine that goal. Well, I can tell you, he would have ousted most of us because what we do today often counter the idea of this unified sovereign homeland. He wanted to burn down all the white men's homes, and then he wanted the natives to live very humbly in these huts on the ground. And then he wanted his people to return to their traditions and live well. But you have to understand, in Tecumseh's time, the state of chaos in a native community and the impact of alcohol and that the chiefs were signing away land left and right, desperately trying to create a future, made him very angry at what was going on. So maybe it's ironic that Tecumseh also gets killed during the War of 1812, unable to fulfill that fierce vision that he had. The other side, Handsome Lake, he had this vision in 1799. He was a Seneca, and in his vision he said many things, but this one always struck me. He said you should send 12 boys to the white man's school to learn their ways. He wasn't sexist, say not send girls, but back then he said send these 12 boys. Perhaps only 2 will come back. In 1799, they expected an 80% dropout rate of our students. But they also knew that in order to live well, the kids that came back had to be able to put through the ceremonies, had to speak their language, and most importantly, they had to be good parents because the domestic situation was not very good. We come from a society where the women are really in charge, but during this time, it all kind of got perverted, and all of a sudden, the man is in charge. You heard the phrase, a man's home is his castle? Well, that didn't come in Iroquois country. The house, the children, the fields, the crops, managed by women. So what happened when this twisted, the women lost their voice and the men became bad partners, bad parents. The future is going to be very bleak, Handsome Lake said, unless we can act to strengthen the hearts, minds, bodies, and spirits of our youth. Well, I realize that's why we're all here, but this was 1799 when he saw this stuff and how difficult it's going to be. John Brant, who's Joseph Brant's son who fought in the war, fought right here in Queenston, but he's a very unusual character because he adopted so much of the white man's way that even his own mother said, John, except for your moccasins, I don't know what's left of you being Mohawk. He dressed like an Englishman, he spoke really well, he translated the Bible, but see, his vision was, if we are going to survive, we have to be like the English. Look at us. We're speaking English, dress like them, live like them. Look at this place. It's not a longhouse. So maybe his vision wasn't that far off. Now, but he lamented he wanted a white wife, but he would have said is no white woman is going to want this poor little savage. So he suffered from a little bit of low self-esteem. He was also the first non-native to be elected into the early parliamentary legislature here in Ontario, but then he was ousted because the guy that he lost to filed a charge that John Brant wasn't a citizen, nor were the natives who voted for him. So he got put out of office, and then the other guy took this office. And talk about ironic justice. Cholera got both of them, and they died before that guy to take his seat. But our people took stock in this, that maybe John was going too far. Maybe he was making too many compromises. Maybe he was giving up too much. His father, Joseph Brant, had a great vision, too, about the Haldeman Tract and why we should move here. And he wanted us to model our ways after our white neighbors so that we could find a way to coexist, which is probably why they put him on their dollar. And we need an economic stream now. Joseph Brant was the first one to talk about that. And that we provide perpetual care for our people. We need an honorable way to make a living. Part of that was by leasing and selling land, but that's another matter. But we also need trusting allies in order to build a productive future. Here's an old peace medal, I forget what it says, 1780. Happy, well united. Well, I'm an old hippie. That meant a whole other thing back then. But happy, well united with the English means that we are allies and we're going to be partners in that. So what we heard this morning is no different than Brant's vision. We've got to work together on this. Red Jacket, like I mentioned, from across the river, had a different vision. He says the earth itself is all we need to sustain us. The earth provides everything, all the medicines, all the plants, all of the spirit, all the knowledge, all of our ancestors are buried there. There's our school. However, our seats have once large have become very poor. We're very small people. So we don't need more religion. We don't need more churches. We need to practice our own beliefs better. But he did say something very important that I think applies to us. And we have to stop fighting wars we can't win. Like an old warrior, you're looking at a situation, some institutions you can't move sideways. You can spend all your time and energy trying to break down that wall of prejudice or misunderstanding or racism, or spend your energy at producing stronger people who will still have to fight that. But I think there's an important lesson there. We can, you could take a horse, put all kinds of eagle feathers on them, but in the end, you still have a horse. It's not an eagle. So you want an eagle, go get an eagle. Now we have this very old idea called the two-row wampum. This is a photograph of the actual wampum belt. It's still a little tattered and torn, but this was from the first agreement we made with the Dutch. And the symbol of the belt is that we're all traveling down the river of life together, them in their ship and us in our canoe. But the big story behind this says these two vessels are linked together. And that covenant chain I talk about, it ties our vessels together. And we're going down the river together. And so it's been mistranslated into thinking that it's like separate but equal. You got to stay in a canoe or stay in a ship. Well, I taught at a university most of my life. Where was I? I had 1 foot in the canoe and 1 foot in the ship. The other thing to remember, though, not all natives are alike. This was from a study done among people who work for Indian Affairs in Ottawa back in the 70s. Maybe it's a little jaded to begin with. But back then, they identified 6 personality traits of our people who go to work for the government. First one, are they're optimistic about the future. They want to work within the system. We'll make things better. We'll do what we can in Ottawa. The others are personally motivated. They basically said, I don't really care about the community. I just want to be able to retire well, so I'm just going to cash in and do what I can. The third group were justice-oriented, and they had a lot of pride, and they wanted to see the right thing done for their people. Others were tradition-oriented, and they're kind of indifferent about social trends and changing policy. They just want to say, our tradition is our saving grace. And there was a small group of isolationists, which makes you wonder, what were they doing working at Indian Affairs? But anyway, they said, just leave me alone. So a lot of them worked in the basement down there. And then there was a large group of people who's just status quo. Don't rock the boat. We get a little trickle of funds from Ottawa. Don't upset it because it was hard-earned money, and just back off. But what I'm getting at is that these are now the grandparents of your students. Their thinking and what their grandparents thought influences the child. So just when you have a native kid walking up, just imagine trying to figure out which one of these 6 personality profiles they're coming from. And what we've learned in education, one size does not fit all. If we learned anything about learning styles, we have to come up with something that addresses this diversity. And I'm sure each of you could add a few more things to this profile. One of our good friends, Tim and I, was a guy named John Mohawk, who unfortunately passed away quite prematurely. But John had a vision about the future, about how we have to decolonize ourselves. And I started thinking about how his vision relates to what the War of 1812 warriors had. So I'm going to just run through these very quickly, but they're important. And I'm going to leave this PowerPoint with the powers to be here. So anybody wants it, feel free to do what you want with it. But John says we have to recognize the forces of change. We have to understand our history. How did we get in this situation? But we can't get trapped in victimizing ourselves, thinking we can't get out of that. But you have to understand what are the forces of change that make things happen. And decide what you want to keep. What is it that's in the canoe that we need? What is it from the ship that we need? And we make a conscious decision to use that. Just like Joseph Brant, we had to find allies for constructive change. We cannot do this job alone. We need each other, and we need whatever kind of partners we can find to do that. But allies is very different than subjects. And allies strengthen each other. A nation nurtures its people, and they in turn nurture the nation. Boy, that's a big statement, but boy, isn't that important. If our young people don't feel any nurturing from their nation, their community, why should they stick around? We're not providing that sense of place, of satisfaction, and at the same time, the nation needs to be nurtured by that young thinking. I saw a T-shirt on a guy the other day. He says, "The older I get, the better I used to be." And it's really true. We think we were the only real people, the only real ironworkers, the only real everything when we were younger is better than today. Well, like it or not, the future is about those young people. And if we don't help them, empower them, there will be no native nations in the future. We have to rebuild our community institutions to make them functional. We have a lot of dysfunction in our communities, a lot of silo thinking that just goes nowhere. More importantly, we have to be open to new ideas, new skills, and new ways of accomplishing things. The warriors in 1812 could not have taken that Queenston Heights and held back the Americans if they didn't master that rifle, if they didn't master the pistol, the sword, they didn't understand the military command, they didn't know what was going on. They had to master those new skills at that time. John said it's going to take money to make a difference. We heard that this morning, and it's really true. It's not always about the money, but it's pretty hard to do this monumental shift if you can't afford the infrastructure to make it happen and train people well. Now think about this. Decision makers must be impacted by their decisions. How are you impacted personally by your educational decisions for others? Our administrators, our schools, our parents, the communities, we have to think about this. When we make a decision, it has to be, we have to be part of the impact of that so we understand it. Consider the long haul, not short-term game, and in many ways that's what's happening in Native education. It's short-term things come up and we try things and it's a big experiment. There's only 1,200 Tuscaroras in the whole world. 1% of them live in my house. I got 9 kids. I was out of work a lot and I had nothing else to do but make kids, so. And then with the baby bonus, why not? So, but what happened here was that for my kids that are over 30, I just sent them to public school. That's what everybody did. My kids who are 20, I said, no, I want them to go to reserve school. And now my kids who are very young, I got 2 little kids at home, 7 and 2 years old, we're trying something radically different that I'll get to in a minute. But so I have been experimenting on my own children, on their education, which sometimes they don't appreciate. John says, keep your cultural values viable. Don't just list them on the wall and say, here's our values. Your values have to be the way you think, the way you speak, and the things you do. And if we don't do that, you can think you're doing well, but then treat others poorly. So our cultural values are very important, and they can be integrated anywhere. And they don't have to be just isolated in the community or in the ceremony or in that canoe. You carry your value with you. We have to gain these problem-solving skills because often this is what our people don't have. When I did work at Indian Affairs for a while, I couldn't believe how many people came to Ottawa and say, could we please do this? Could we try this, please? And then it was like whatever government allowed you to do is what you did. There's a different thing here about solving our own problems with our own culture and values for our own purpose. And then finally, John advocated, think of the principles, not about rules or laws. There's all kinds of rules, there's all kinds of reasons that you can't do something, but if you understand the principles behind something, what is it that motivates our thinking, you can apply that today. So to what end? When I look at the Native institutions like Polytechnic and the other community-based education programs, they're struggling very hard to recreate healthy relationships among our people. within ourselves. As you know, colonization left a big scar on a lot of our people. Sometimes we have this lateral violence between us. A lot of our kids don't feel this spiritual connection to the earth. Those voices, the warriors' voices are still here in this land, those thundering voices from Niagara. We tap into that. There's great power there. But we also have to hear the voice of what they call these kids that are coming up out of the ground, the new faces that are born there. We stand in the middle between that ancestral voice and those young baby ears that are waiting to hear these words of encouragement. But more importantly, too, we face new realities that those warriors had no idea were going to come. My grandfather was a farmer. My dad became an iron worker. My dad dropped out of school in 6th grade. But get this, my dad ends up building the university campus that I taught in Buffalo. I talk about transition, farming to iron worker to teaching, but now I teach about ironwork and farming, but I've never done it. Just a joke, just a joke. I worry about the impact of technology on our children because you can see that. And I don't want to always focus on the negatives, but sometimes I worry that we are trying to replace what used to be a conversation between humans, that ancestral voice, with this one-sided conversation from this shiny thing. And I believe it's beginning to kind of numb the minds of our people because then they don't learn how to respond back. They don't learn about that voice, using their voice, using their mind. So we have to be cautious about the function of technology. So to what end? Also, we need to embrace these rights and understand our responsibilities. It's not all about saying we got a treaty right to hunt, but it's understanding how you hunt well, how you have an environmental ethic, and in how you share. We also need to increase the engagement with the systems and structures that sustain our existence. I used to laugh a long time ago. We used to make fun about, well, we don't have a word for art. So, and art is a white man's concept. I said, but we also don't have a word for paycheck, and I don't see anybody giving it up because they want to be indigenous. Closing the gap that is the knowledge gap that resulted from colonization, and it's true, we have to recognize that the reason why some of our people have poor intellectual skills, it's not because they're genetically dumb, it's because it was beaten out of them, this fear of knowledge, fear of standing up and being yourself. And so we have to help them slowly recover from that. Even though you can find a child now who's 3 generations away from residential school, they carry the residue of that strife, as you know. And ultimately, when we greet each other, we say, Nyawe Scano. I am thankful that you are well and you're at peace. Being well and at peace is the objective that even the warriors wanted. So we have to find a way for our young people to contribute to a peaceful way of life. It's very important. Here's my formula for that. The most important thing that you can do when you go back home is to change the diet of our children, because they're being overloaded with things that destroy the ability of their brain to think, to remember. As glorious as this meal was, for you diabetics in the audience, you know, this is like playing with a loaded gun. So think about that how food, spirit food, like the corn, raises up the mind. Commodified food crushes the mind. So what we're trying to do is to restore that spirit food to our kids so that they will be able to fulfill and be the kind of people they're intended to be. So I'm going to end here very quickly, talking about what we're trying to do as an alternative. Remember what I said about trying to put a round culture in a square room? So we got a round school. We started this community, real community-based, basically it's a parental homeschooling initiative, but we brought 2 streams of thought together. We looked at this Waldorf education. Waldorf said it by Rudolf Steiner over in the 1920s, over across the big water. But Steiner got this idea that we are spiritual beings on this journey of life, that nature is the ultimate teacher, and that children have a different developmental cycle than most of us think is true. And what he saw is public education, as was construed then, was actually destroying the ability of our children to think well. Now, this is 1920. So we're trying to take the best of that Waldorf thinking. Waldorf right now is probably the fastest growing private school movement in the world. And I encourage you to take a look at it. It's also a little convoluted sometimes, and very different and dense, but this concept of freeing our children putting them back on the earth. In our school here, a very small school, the kids spend most of the day outdoors. And we don't tell them, there's the white pine, you know, there's the creek, there's the squirrel. We let them experience it, and then it absorbs into them. It becomes their intuition. But this is also a Mohawk immersion school. So they hear Mohawk all day long. And we have little kids, kind of like kindergarten age, and then like first and second grade age. And my daughter, who knew very little Mohawk when she started, she's now entering her third year, she talks half the time I don't understand her, because she learns so much without, get this, without ever reading or writing Mohawk. Without ever seeing it on a computer, she could out-talk most of the adults who went to an academic program to learn Mohawk in 3 years. So there's something going on there. So what we're about is building the whole child to be resilient and strong in the world, because I believe that's what our ancestors in 1812 wanted. At the same time, they realized that this duality that comes into our lives. You know, when I used to teach at the university, most of the young students that came to me would have 3 questions. Who am I? Where do I belong? And what am I supposed to do? Well, you could say those are the questions of everybody's life, but particularly for our native students. So what we're trying to do is put an end to those 3 questions and get them to answer it before they're 12. You know who you are. You know where you belong. And you know what you're supposed to do. So then, as you turn into a young adult, you can gain the skills to enhance what you already understand should be true. And then I believe you'll be a productive citizen in the native nation. You'll be doing good work for everybody. You'll believe in peace, and that you will finally, since 1491, be happy. So thank you very much for that.